that you're gone, oh, I can feel you. Oh, it haunts me. You're not welcome. Leave me be. You knew my eyes. You traced my body. You painted pictures in my dream skies. Then we built a world so tall it crumbled. We got so lost deep in the rubble. So unpack our dreams, unfold reality. You don't give me anything anymore. Unspoken, love they soaked in rose fallacies. Stuck in this dream, warped by your vacancy, rewinding fantasies through old poetry won't set me free. Rewrite the last page, refilm the final scene. Dream an ending more transcending. Silver steel that can pull me from how you hold me still. I'll wake one day. You're gone, oh, I can feel you, oh, it haunts me. You're not welcome, leave me be.
All right, everybody. Welcome back for Audio Hour Week 5. And today we are going to be talking about dynamic processing. Specifically, well, there's really only two kinds, compression and gating. For reasons that will become obvious by the end of this episode, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about compression than we are about gating. But that's okay, because that's more fun anyway. So, got my demonstration session up here, and we're just going to dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and preface, again, this is just a copy of a session that I'm working on right now. It is unreleased, so I will not be playing back any vocals. I've also shuffled all my plugins around so that I can batch, mute, and unmute my dynamics processing so you guys can see the difference that it makes across an entire mix. So just ignore how weird this all probably looks. But first, it's probably worth establishing some terms here. this episode is entirely about a class of processors known as dynamics processors. Dynamics in this case refers to musical dynamics, specifically the range between the loudest point of a particular part and the quietest point of a particular part, or that can be applied to the entire summation of the parts as well, to the entire mix, the loudest part of a mix or the quietest part. The distance in perceived loudness between the loudest part and the quietest part comprises the dynamic range of your source material. And dynamics processors allow you to exert some control over that. The most common portion of that is compression. Compressors are every bit as ubiquitous as EQs in terms of their use in a mix. And when they're used properly and used in conjunction with EQ properly, that will get you about 90% of your mix. Mixing, by and large, is really not as I'm not going to say as complicated, but it's not as dealing in these crazy abstract effects and these crazy like sound design things. Like the bulk of a good mix is going to be achieved with strategic EQing and knowing how to utilize your compressors properly, both at the level of each individual input and thinking about the way the choices that you made at the levels of the input will translate as they're combined into an entire mix. So there's a common misconception out there that I would like to address, which is that compressors make things louder. That isn't true. Actually, the opposite is true. But there's a reason people think that, and I will get to that. So what a compressor does is it simply reduces the difference between the loudest part of a program and the quietest part of a program. And the way it does that is by reducing the volume of the loudest part. So it makes the loudest part quieter. I will say that again. Compressors make things quieter. They do not make them louder. The compressor will afford you a certain amount of control over the way in which the peaks, the loudest parts, are turned down. But in general, they all have one thing in common, and that is that they make their source material quieter. But the reason that the misconception exists that compression makes things louder is that by reducing the dynamic range of a part, you are in general able to make that part louder overall. And the part may be perceived as louder overall, and we'll get into why that is later in this episode. But really what compressors do at a textbook level is put the dynamic range of a certain part in a more manageable space, such that it can be combined with other parts and not get lost, but also not stick out. Again, proper EQing can achieve a lot of that too, but this applying compression deals more strictly with the level than with frequency overlap, although we will also get into how frequency and dynamic range compression are interrelated and how they affect one another. But first, we are going to discuss the controls of a compressor. Compressors are able to have usually 5, sometimes 6 in this case, but really 5 controls is what is like the max that you have control over. Some compressors don't give you all 5 controls. But let's go over each one. I've used this particular compressor plugin because 1, it's stock to Pro Tools, and 2, it gives you this handy graphic representation of what's happening, which I think will help illustrate what each of these parameters does. So the first parameter that you need to be aware of the 5, is threshold. Now, the threshold allows you to define the point that if a source becomes louder than that threshold that you set, it will be compressed. The compressor will turn it down to reduce the dynamic range. Anything that's quieter than the threshold will not be affected, but as soon as the source crosses that threshold, it is going to be turned down. Just to kind of give you that graphic representation, the threshold in this graph is the orange line, the orange vertical line here. So if I turn this up all the way to 0, source material is not going to be compressed because everything will be below the threshold. And if I were to bring it all the way down, everything in the sound source would be compressed because everything would be above the threshold. So obviously you don't really want to do either of those two things. You want to have it somewhere in the middle, and where it is will be dependent upon your source material. So let's say I start with it here all the way open and play back this sound source here. Here we go. Okay, so we've got some room mics happening here. You can see the little moving dot. That represents the input level. That's also marked by the input meters over here. So we can see that its peak, like that snare hit, is around negative 10 dB. So if we want to start compressing this, we're going to bring the threshold down until that little moving dot crosses it. You can see when it gets to the other side, it turns red. That means it's being compressed. Okay. So there's our threshold. And let's say I'm going to set it here for now. Okay. Now, we know that once a sound source becomes louder than the threshold, it's going to be compressed. But how is it going to be compressed, and by how much? That brings us to our next control, which is ratio, which is over here. The ratio is, it sets the amount. So the first number in the ratio refers to the number of decibels above the threshold that a source must be in order to increase the output level by 1 decibel. So what does that mean? So that means if my threshold right now is negative 27 decibels, then a sound source would have to get to negative 24 decibels in order to be outputted as negative 26 decibels, 1 decibel above the threshold. These numbers can range from, less than 1, well, not less than 1, sorry, less than 2, somewhere between 1 and 2, all the way up to, this particular compressor gives you up to 100, which would constitute limiting, which we'll talk about towards the end here. Generally, in mixing, your ratio levels are going to be in the, less than 2 to 6 range, unless you're really going for some kind of specifically compressed effect. So for something like room mics, you're really not going to want to compress that super heavily. And we'll get into why that is as we go. But I'm going to set this preliminarily at, let's say 2 to 1. So that means that the output level will only be raised 1 decibel for every 2 decibels increase of the input level above the threshold. So if I have a sound source that is inputting at negative 25 decibels, it will be output as negative 26. But that takes time to happen because, music and audio is time bound. So it's not like it crosses the threshold and it's immediately quieter. That compression process has to happen in a certain amount of time, which brings us to our third control, which is attack. This refers to the amount of time in milliseconds between the sound source crossing the threshold and that sound source being compressed. So it allows you to control the amount of time before a source is turned down. Typically, your attack times in mixing are going to be between 1 and 15 milliseconds-ish, sometimes a little faster. But thinking about the implications of that, so if we have our threshold and our ratio set, we're going to play back these room mics. So you notice it's only above the threshold at 2 points in the drum beat. That's at the kick drum and at the snare drum. Cymbal wash is hanging out kind of below. Now, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to... So what the attack time allows you to do is basically decide how much transient information you want to leave in a sound source. Transient being the attack, like the crack of a snare here. I can just quit talking about it and show you. All of these tall lines here. See how there's nothing, big spike, quick decay, little bit of a sustain, and then it's gone. This big spike is called the transient. Drums obviously are going to have like more transient information than, say, a violin. And that's a consideration that you have to take into account when you're setting a compressor. So I'm dealing with transient heavy source material here, but I'm also understanding that in this particular case, I'm affecting a room mic. So I have other perspectives where I'm going to get that. So maybe I don't want a lot of transient information in my room mic in this case, or maybe I do. If I chose that I didn't want to have a lot of transient information in my room mic, I wanted to have it be a more consistent level throughout, I would set a faster attack time, like 1 millisecond. And that sounds like this. Compared to, so you notice when it's higher, you get more of that crack, that attack from the snare, compared to, see how it's more kind of flat, it's kind of dead, but it's more even, the level's more consistent, because more of that audio is being compressed because the compressor is being applied more quickly. For the sake of this, I'm going to set this kind of in between where we were. I'm going to go 3 milliseconds. Preserves just that front end of that transient and then pulls it back so it doesn't hang out for too long. So if compression takes time to be applied, then it stands to reason that it also takes time to be unapplied, to be removed. And that brings us to our fourth control, which is release. Basically just attack time in reverse. It's the amount of time in milliseconds, or sometimes in seconds, depending on the compressor and the source material. Refers to the amount of time after the source has fallen below the threshold again, how long it takes for the compression to stop being applied. In terms of applying compression to individual elements in a mix, you're probably looking at between a 30 millisecond release and maybe up to 300 millisecond release. If you're talking about compressing buses, like groups of tracks, or master buses, like your entire mix, your release times will most likely be a little bit longer than that. But regardless, the thing to understand about release, if it is truly the reverse of attack, is so if a faster attack leads to less transient information and a slower attack leads to more transient information, a faster release will generally lead to like a more forward sounding program material, and a slower release will lead to a more smooth, more transparent application of the compression, but it also is going to keep the sound compressed for longer. So I'll kind of over exaggerate this so you can hear what I'm talking about. So I'm going to turn this all the way up. Now you can look over here on the left at your meters. Here's your input level. Notice how much lower the output level is. And this meter on the right is very important, and all compressors will give this to you in some form or fashion. This is the gain reduction meter, meaning the amount of decibels that by which the peaks are being reduced. In this case, it's pretty heavy at negative 6 dB, and it just stays there because we got a long release. But if we go to a really fast release and get back to this louder section, and you notice it's kind of like almost imperceptible now that it's being compressed. If I were to bring it up from here, you're going to start to notice it's kind of like breathing, which is called pumping artifacts, because it's, our attack is allowing a little bit of that transient through, and then it's clamping down, but then the release right now is pretty quick, so it's just like attack, quick fade, and then it's immediately back up to level. So it sounds kind of weird. Sometimes that's an effect that you want. Sometimes that will make tracks like this, like with cymbal information, just kind of like lift up out of the wash. But also, it's an inconsistent output level after that, which may or may not be desirable. So for something like this, I might aim a little bit on the faster side. Say around 60 for me. All right, so if we play this back again and we look at our meter section over here on the left, we notice that the cymbal level of the input and the output is pretty much the same because it's generally below the threshold, but the peak level of the output is much lower than that of the input. We have made the source material quieter, which again is the function of a compressor. But maybe that's not what we wanted to do entirely. Maybe we just wanted to tame the peaks a little bit so they didn't jump out of the track so much. So now overall it's too quiet in our mix. That brings us to our last control, which is makeup gain. Sometimes it's just called gain, sometimes it's called output level, but all compressors will give you an option to raise the output level to compensate for the amount of gain reduction that the compressor is applying. So if we if we bypass this compression that we've done, and then apply it. So in this case, it's still pretty even, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to bring this up a little bit and add like 1.5 decibels. Call it 2 decibels. So you notice with this bypassed, and then if I reapply it, I have made it louder with the makeup gain than the original, which is the basis for the misconception that compression makes things louder. Again, it doesn't. It just allows you to make them louder if you choose. In this case, I wouldn't choose that. In this case, the compression settings that we've applied to this source, in my opinion, don't justify adding any makeup gain back. But for the sake of demonstration. Also, some compressors, usually only digital compressors, give you a 6th control parameter, which is knee. Knee just refers to the slope of the actual threshold. So like rather than, if you look at this graph, if you notice how it's a linear straight line until we hit the threshold, and then there's like an angular cut by 2, like, so it's half as steep after the threshold, but it immediately becomes half as steep. Knee lets you smooth that out. I don't know how well you'll see it on the graph, but oh yeah. So you notice that it kind of just smooths out that curve. So the compression might start a little before the threshold, and it might be a little easier after the threshold for a point, so that this allows it to be less transparent. You don't hear it as much. Sometimes it's nice to have. Usually, with most compressors, you don't have that control, and if you set them properly, you don't necessarily need it so much. But that's what that is, if you come across it and are inclined to use it. So we've talked about the controls that compressors give you. Now I think it's important to mention the types of compressors. There are 4 different types of compressors. We will start chronologically, and I think I'm going to use the snare for this example. So I'm going to go ahead and bypass the compression that I have applied to the snare. I've left all my EQs on, like we talked about last week. So the oldest type of compressor is called tube compression or variable mu compression. They look kind of like this. This is an emulation of the Fairchild 660, which is a really old style of compressor, highly sought after. There's still a couple around, and they are very expensive and coveted among studio engineers. But in the analog version of this, within this, there would be vacuum tubes through which the sound would pass, and depending on the level of the sound, a certain amount of that would be burned off in the tube, so that the output would be quieter than the input. If you notice on this, it does not give you all of the controls. It gives you an input gain, a threshold control, no ratio control, a time constant control, which affects both the attack and the release, and your makeup gain. The reason that a lot of these analog compressors or the analog modeled compressors give you an input control is because when you're dealing with analog components, sometimes you'll want to do what's called drive the compressor. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but that is especially important in the case of a tube compressor because the ratio is what's called program dependent. You don't have variable control of the amount of compression that is applied. The amount of compression that is applied, because it happens like electrically within the tube element, is dependent on the source going through it. So if a source is louder, it is going to be compressed at a higher ratio than a quieter source. So this input gain stage allows you to choose effectively what your max ratio will become, as well as how much, tube saturation you get. So I'll start with this bypass so you can hear just the dry snare. All right, so there's our snare sound. And I'm going to start with my threshold at 0 so there's no compression. We can just hear the input. So ideally, for now, we just want to match. We want the input gain to be the same bypassed as not. So you can hear it is adding a little bit. So we're going to go to, say, 10. And I'm reading this backwards. Okay, so that sounds pretty even. Maybe go a little lower, down to 15. All right, so we've matched our input level, and then we can set our threshold for a desired amount of compression. This meter here is your gain reduction in decibels. Maybe something light to start with. And then we can adjust our timing. Now, since this isn't labeled in milliseconds, you kind of just have to use your ears. In general, 1 is going to be a fast attack and a fast release, and 6 is going to be a faster attack with a longer release. All the attacks are more or less the same in this case, but the release time gets longer as you go. Maybe something like this. And we bypass. So it is losing some level, so we're going to make it up here. Okay. So there's your basic rundown of a tube compressor. The next type we're going to talk about, which was the next type to come to be, is the FET compressor. FET stands for Field Effect Transistor, which is a complicated little piece of electrical engineering which involves reducing a voltage source relative to a parallel voltage source. I'm not going to get super into the mechanical workings of an FET compressor, but basically the effect of it compared to a tube compressor is your attack and release times are able to happen much more quickly because there's no tube element, meaning there's no like mechanical process for the sound to pass through. It all can happen almost instantaneously because you're purely dealing with electrical energy. This particular compressor is modeled off of the most famous FET compressor, the Universal Audio 1176. Again, you notice that the the controls are laid out a little bit differently, but you do, in this case, actually have all 5 again. You have, well, minus a threshold, but you'll see how you can sort of set a threshold here. So there is like a fixed point at which the compressor will begin compressing in an FET compressor, and you can use your input level to control that, basically making the source material louder or quieter so that the desired amount is crossing the fixed threshold. You have your makeup gain following that. The attack time and release time are 1 through 7, which are kind of arbitrary values, but even the slowest attack time is, I think, maybe 1 millisecond, if not a little less. FET compressors deal in microseconds on the attack. So like 1 would be the slowest, 7 is the fastest. Again, you just kind of have to use your ears to figure out where you want it. And then the release, same deal. 7 would be the fastest and 1 would be the slowest. And then you have certain fixed ratios you can select. You can select 4, 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, 20 to 1. 1176 has also had this all function, which is like a super hard limit. We can keep this on 4 for now. So what you would do in this case is you'd play your material back. So you can see on your gain reduction, this is being reduced by like 6 dB. I don't want to take that much out of it, so I'm going to reduce my input gain. So now we're looking more like 3-ish, a little less, which is more what I would want. But it's a little slow. It's kind of sluggish. So I'm going to speed up the attack time. I'm going to really speed up the release time so that it like jumps out back a little quicker. And this is what makes FET compressors really powerful, is like listen to the difference between this and this. Yeah. So without, with. And we have made it a little bit louder, so we might take some gain out of it. Not much, though. So there's FET compression. Next is we have VCA compression, which stands for voltage controlled amplifier. Electrically speaking, this is the simplest type of compression. It's also the most versatile type of compression. So if we look at tube compression as like a medium speed, like in terms of its time, and the FET as super fast, this is kind of in between those. Like it's pretty fast, but it can be, you can slow it down if you want. You have the most control of the parameters with a VCA compressor because of the simplicity of its circuitry. This simply works by, if a voltage crosses the threshold amount, it reduces the voltage by the ratio amount. Pretty simple, which in turn allows you to have a pretty wide range of controls. So VCA compressors are typically understood to be the most versatile and the most transparent. This is modeled off of the API 2500 bus compressor, which is again, a famous and highly sought after VCA compressor. This all works identically to the demonstration that I showed earlier. This particular module also gives you a knee control within 3 settings, a feedback and a feed forward control, which just refers to how the circuit analyzes the signal going through it. If it is giving itself like a buffer time, like looking ahead of the signal so that the compression can be applied more smoothly, or if it's purely just reacting as it comes across. And a thrust control, which is kind of like sort of like a side chain, which we may or may not talk about in this episode, but it basically allows you to allow low-end information to pass the compressor without being compressed by 3 settings. But yeah, beyond that, you notice you've got, down to 0.03 of a millisecond of an attack time to as high as 30 milliseconds. You've got all the way up to infinity, theoretically, in your ratio, down to 1.5. You've got as high as 3 seconds in your release and as fast as 50 milliseconds. So you've really got a wide range of options here. I'm not going to go through setting that for the sake of time, since this is effectively identical to the demonstration. And then the 4th type is an optical compressor. So if FET compressors are the fastest, VCAs are in between. Variable mu compressors are kind of midline. The opticals are the slowest. The reason for that is they work by converting the audio into light energy. There's like a diode inside of the compressor which gets brighter the louder a sound source gets, and then there's a light sensitive resistor circuit which will attenuate the output signal based on how bright the light is. That is to say, how loud the sound is. This particular compressor is modeled off of the Universal Audio LA2A, really common optical compressor, kind of the prototypical optical compressor. Now here you notice we've got the fewest controls of any of them. We've only got a gain, which is input, and a peak reduction, which is sort of like your ratio and your threshold rolled into one. No attack or release times. Your release times, remember how in the variable mu compressor, your threshold was program dependent? Well, with an optical compressor, your release and attack are kind of program dependent. The louder something is, the faster the release time is going to be, and the quieter something it is, the slower the release time is going to be. Now, because of that, we're going to want to input match again, meaning if we bypass this and turn it on, we don't want the level to be different. We want it to be the same loudness. So without, so we can hear that that's significantly louder. Maybe we'll do something like this. That's still louder. Maybe even a little less. Okay, so that's about even. So now, if I set this to 0, so there's no compression, we can turn this knob up until we're achieving the desired amount of gain reduction. So let's aim for -3. Slowly turn this up. Not too much. So you notice, if you go really high, don't want that. Since the time constants are program dependent, really high levels of compression are going to be really heavily pumping because the attack time is so slow with an optical compressor. Something like that. So now you can see how, the characteristics of one over the other might inform, why you would want to use one compressor or another. Like, you know, you might choose to use an FET compressor on your drums because it's the fastest and the drums are the most transient dependent. So you would be able to address those better with a really fast compressor. And you might choose to use an optical compressor on something like a vocal or an acoustic guitar where you want, you know, it's limited in its transient information. So you want to preserve as much of it as possible while bumping up the level post-transient. Or normalizing the level post-transient rather, so that you can overall make the source louder. You might choose a tube compressor to get kind of the best of both worlds between an FET and an optical, and you might use a VCA just as a default on anything because you know that it's the most, it offers the user the most control. But the point where compressors really differentiate themselves from each other and also from other classes of processing is in their coloration. Based on their, you know, their component mechanism, they will impart a certain color, so to speak, to a sound, which is really just to say, will distort the sound in a way that could be pleasing or idiomatic of a certain taste. Just to kind of illustrate that here, let me use the bass for this example. I'll just bypass the compression on the bass. So if I call up an optical compressor and really exaggerate it, see how that kind of starts to get this fuzz, but it's like, it's this warmth too, and this like, it's more harmonically rich. So if I bypass that and call up, say, tube compressor, drive this kind of. So you notice compared to the distortion of the optical, it's a little, maybe a little less apparent, more what I would describe as like soft clipping or a saturation, where it's hard to describe. Sound like, it almost sounds like it's melting a little bit, but in a pleasing sort of way. Here, I'll compare the two. That's optical. It's tube. And then if I threw up an FET, so there, it's obviously not as warm. It's a little brighter. It's also compressing really heavily, which we don't necessarily want. It's a little bit more in your face, a little more top heavy compared to these. There's your tube, optical, back to FET. And then if we were to use a VCA, see how it's a little bit smoother. You don't really hear it being applied. So, and that is as valid a use of compression as dealing with dynamic range. I actually, especially with me being exclusively digital in my mixing capability at the moment, I find myself reaching for compressors more for their color aspects than for their dynamic control aspects. Just imparts a more, I don't know, a more characteristic, more distinctive sound. Um, so let me show you how that translates in the context of an entire mix here. I've got all my compressors on the same insert slot, so I can turn them on and off across the whole mix. So let me play you the mix without them first. So this is EQ, no compression. So notice that if you listen to the frequencies, like our EQ from last week, there's really nothing overlapping, but there's still like, it's kind of hard to discern parts. They're a little washy, kind of losing the kick drum. The hi-hat's kind of jumping out a lot. That guitar solo is. So things are just kind of out of balance. They're not necessarily frequency issues, but things just don't seem to have their, like they may have a frequency space, but they don't have a dynamic space. Relative volumes are kind of hard to discern. So if I put this back in, and I apply the compression, so now all of a sudden that snare is exactly dead center, right where you go. The cymbals are there with the delay. You hear the kick drum. It's sitting just fine with the bass. The guitars are where they need to be relative to each other and relative to the mix. Everything's behaving nicely with itself. And that's a characteristic that you would want in something like this where you're listening to just the rhythm section, just drums, bass, and guitar. You don't want to have to be... later episodes we're going to be talking about a process called automation. You really don't want to be automating your rhythm section too much. If you mix it properly with the correct compression settings, you probably won't need to. Like, I can just listen to this and everything's playing back at the exact level I would want it all day long. And just for the sake of showing it, I'm actually almost entirely using VCA compressors. So on the guitars, I'm using DBX 160, which is another famous VCA compressor. On the bass, I'm using an optical compressor, the Universal Audio LA3A, which is of similar construction to the LA2A, but just kind of a different coloration, a little bit more brightness preserved. On my overheads, my room mics, I'm using a DBX 160 again. On my toms and on my snare and on my kick, all the rest of my drums, I'm using a VCA compressor here, an API 2500. On my drum bus, I'm using an FET compressor, an 1176. And actually, I've got a compressor on my master bus too, another VCA compressor, the SSLG. Just lightly compressing every input as it's combined, just to kind of place everything in a similar space. So one thing to understand, obviously, compression across an entire mix at the individual level has the potential to make a massive night and day difference and really make your job easier. But also understand that it is going to affect your frequency balance too. Let me show you what I mean. So if I play back just this guitar for right now. So you look at the frequency of this guitar, not a lot in the low end, really doesn't get to full value until 150-ish, and then kind of tapers off after 600 before a drastic drop before 8K, and then it's kind of flat. Mid-range heavy instrument, as guitars are. But if I were to start compressing this, watch what happens to the frequency meter over here. So you notice it starts to look more like a flat line, like it's kind of just straight across, brings the low end information up a little bit, and it reduces the top end information a little bit. And that makes sense, right? I mean, if a source is louder, it's probably louder at a certain frequency. So if you're compressing it, it's that frequency that's going to be diminished first. So if something is heavily compressed, the frequency curve of that sound source will most likely be trending as a flat line. Sometimes that's something you want. Sometimes it isn't. Most of the time it isn't, unless you're talking about an entire mix. So at that point, it becomes important to consider, do I want to place my compressor in my insert chain before my EQ or after my EQ, or do I maybe need to re-EQ after I compress? There's a lot of philosophies on that. There's really, in my opinion, not a hard and fast rule on that. I use it both ways, whether EQing before compression or compressing before EQ for various things. More often than not, I find myself EQing before I compress. A lot of times I'll do something like on my, like say on a source like a snare drum, or really most sources, when I am starting from scratch, I'll call up my equalizer, right, and my compressor together, and I will place my equalizer before my compressor, but I'll set my compressor pre-EQing the signal the way I think I would want it, just listening to the dry signal, and apply the amount of compression that I would want. And then once that's set, I'll EQ through my compressor. So the EQ is still manipulating what is being fed into the compressor, but I'm also hearing like how drastic, or in this case, it would be more likely to be less drastic, my EQ moves are. So like if I didn't have this compressor, this, like on the snare drum, for instance, this 6 dB boost at 7K might sound ridiculous, it might sound super high, but then once I apply the compressor, it sounds just right. So that's typically what I do, EQ before compressor, but set compressor before you EQ, and EQ through the compressor. But there are certain times too, like with these room mics, they all hit this compressor first, and then I equalize that signal. And the reason for that is, for this particular song with these particular room mics, what I wanted to use them for, I wanted them to be a more normal level across the entire song. I was getting my transient information from my close mics, and then I just wanted my, my pitch and my spatial information from the room mics. So I compressed them all first to flatten that frequency curve that they had naturally, and then I could manipulate that curve however I chose with my EQs after that. So those are your predominant considerations with compression. I am going to very quickly demonstrate a gate, a noise gate. It's effectively the same controls as a compressor. except instead of making loud parts quieter, it makes quiet parts non-existent. It's kind of upside down. I'll show you why that's useful. But a gate is pretty much a gate everywhere you go. There's really not different kinds. There's no like coloration characteristics of them. So you'll notice same graph, same attack and release. You have a few different controls, same ratio, same threshold. So I'm going to play back this snare drum. So you notice there's the snare sound, but there's also cymbal sound. There's some kick drum in there. I really only want to hear this channel when the snare is being hit. So since this is a snare close mic, it's theoretically going to be the loudest when the snare drum's being hit, and everything else will be quieter than that. So what I can do is I can raise my threshold such that everything quieter than the snare drum gets muted, and then it just opens up when the snare hits it. And your attack refers to how quickly the gate opens. So, pretty quick you would want that to be. And then the release is how quickly the gate closes. Which again, you generally are going to want to be kind of on the faster side, unless you're trying to achieve a specific effect. Something like that would probably be okay. Some gates also give you this hold control, meaning like the amount of time that the gate will stay open. So like in this case, 50 milliseconds, I could get rid of that if I wanted, or make it longer. So it stays open for longer, allowing a little bit more of the after the transient that you want to stay audible. There's also like a cousin to gate called expansion, which still applies the same way. It makes the quiet parts quieter, but not necessarily mutes them. So that's where this range function comes into play. You notice that instead of being a straight line down, it comes back. So it's only being gated by the 3 dB ratio. And then it's being brought back in. It's only being reduced to a certain point and then being linear again. Sometimes that's necessary, like across an entire mix. If it's overcompressed, it could be like, obviously, if you're doing the mix and you're feeling that it's overcompressed, just change your compressors. But if you're handed a mix and you're asked to like clean it up and it's overcompressed, you could perhaps use an expander to reintroduce some of the dynamic range and make the distance between the loudest points and the quietest points greater, which is to say the opposite of compress it. Yeah, just a quick note, not nearly as fun as compressors, but they can be important, especially in drum mics where there's a lot of microphones close together and therefore a lot of bleed between the microphones. You can set a gate and then that will clean up your channels and allow you to only process the kick drum or the snare drum or the toms, so that those channels are only audible when their desired source is being, played, and then they attenuate when they're not. I think that is enough to get everybody started thinking about dynamics processing. Yeah, next week, week 6, we're going to talk about kind of what you see here. We're going to talk about session layouts, how I myself lay out sessions, and specifically how the biggest part of that is going to be routing within a session, meaning choosing what audio gets sent where and for what reasons. We'll also get into a little bit about the fader section of the channel strip, talking about best practices in panning and fader balancing and things like that. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit more of a global sort of discussion than a specific topic like compression or EQ, but is absolutely an important step to do and like to consider as you're building your mix and before you even begin applying compression and equalization. So, yep, tune in for that same time next week. Until then, thanks for watching.